Hi, folks, and thanks for tuning in. We have an update on the CRJ crash that was in Toronto yesterday. I follow Blancolirio. It's a great channel. He has a channel on aviation and does all these accident reports and stuff. So I have a video coming up from him, which lays out all the parameters and things that went wrong and things that happened during the flight. It's a really extensive video, so I'm going to play that for you, and then I'll get back with you on the other side of the video and discuss a little further. Thanks a lot for watching. Here comes the video.
Yesterday, 17 February, this CRJ 900 jet operated by Endeavor Air for Delta Airlines suffered a hard landing with 80 folks on board, no fatalities, only 18 injuries, landed so hard they broke the right wing off of the aircraft. The accident occurred at 2:12 in the afternoon. The aircraft was landing on Toronto's runway 23, meaning they were heading approximately 230 degrees on landing. The winds reported to the crew, the pilots, just before landing, were reported as 270 at 23 knots, gusting to 33 knots, a right quartering crosswind. There was some blowing snow blowing across the runway, less than 1/8 of an inch. Here's the best video view of the accident to this point, shared on Facebook and social media from a cockpit crew waiting to take off on runway 23. Extremely fortunate that everybody survived this accident. This video, slowed down, shows exactly how this aircraft ended up upside down. The right gear hitting the runway first, the right wing snapping off of the aircraft. The left wing is still producing lift. That left wing raises up like a large sail until the aircraft finally flips all the way over onto its top. Fortunately, it appears that most of that fire may have been involved with the right wing, which was separated from the rest of the airframe, as most of the fuel in the CRJ is located here in the wings. So now that we've seen how this accident happened, based on the plethora of video evidence out there, it's going to be up to investigators to determine why did this happen. And this should be a fairly easy and straightforward investigation, and hopefully we'll have a preliminary report within 2 weeks from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada as to what happened here, because we've got all the evidence we need right at hand, including all this video evidence. They'll be able to corroborate the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, look into the crew history and see who was flying the aircraft and what their experience level was, and be able to put together a pretty quick picture. One of the first questions we got to ask is, how hard did they hit on that landing? Was it hard enough to break that wing off that easily on that aircraft? Or was there some prior maintenance issues with this aircraft, like we saw in the Learjet the other day in Scottsdale, Arizona? In that situation, they had a prior history with that main landing gear that failed on landing. So let's go take a look at the data that we have available right now. One of the first things investigators will be looking at is the stability of the approach. Remember, we are looking at preliminary ADS-B data, which is providing ground speeds. The wind speeds at the time were 270 at 23, gusting to 33 on the ground. As you get higher in altitude, those wind speeds typically increase. But on board the flight data recorder, investigators will be able to determine exactly what airspeed were they flying. Were they flying the correct V-reference ref speed for the conditions, and was the aircraft properly configured for the landing regarding the flap settings? Looking at this preliminary data, it looks like it ends right around 700 feet. So if we assume that that's right close to the ground, take it up to 1,700 feet and look at the last 1,000 feet of the arrival. And specifically, we want to look at the rate of descent. So here they are at 1725 feet ADS-B altitude, 115 knots, again bucking at a minimum a 20-knot headwind. So that would give you an airspeed of at least 135 knots, which about checks for a VREF speed for a CRJ 900. Investigators are going to be closely looking at this rate of descent, and here they are at this data point at 576 feet per minute. They're looking for descent rates that do not exceed 1,000 feet per minute in the last 1,000 feet of the approach. 118 knots ground speed, 800 feet per minute. 110 knots ground speed, 928 feet per minute. 113 knots ground speed, so consistent on the speed, 800 feet per minute. 544 feet per minute. 704 feet per minute. 672 feet per minute, 864 feet per minute, 554 feet per minute. Getting right close to the end of the runway, 118 knots, 544 feet per minute, and 480 feet per minute. So no massive diving for the runway. It looks like a fairly stabilized approach if they're flying their correct VREF speed. A couple things about those VREF speeds in gusty winds. You usually have a wind gust additive specifically for the gusts, and that wind gust additive is not to exceed at 20 knots above your reference speed. So somewhere between VREF plus 5 or VREF plus 20 is going to be your speed for this approach, and that speed will be determined based on your load and your configuration. Generally, you need to carry a little bit more speed for these gusty wind conditions because the winds are gusting. And if you have a 20-knot drop-off all of a sudden in wind speed, as if you have a gust of wind that suddenly drops off by 20 knots, the aircraft can't react quick enough. And so you're going to effectively lose 20 knots of airspeed. So you need to have that buffer above your stall speed in these gusty wind conditions. Now, if we pull the KML data from ADS-B Exchange and put it into Google Earth, we can take a closer look at this final approach. And you can see what appears to be a fairly well stabilized 3-degree glide slope on into the runway. Let's take a closer look. Obviously, this bit of data is in error, but of interest is this last data point from here to here does seem to drop off a little steeper than the rest of the approach. If we take a look back here from behind the aircraft, behind and above, we can see the aircraft begin to drift a little bit to the left of center line, and it looks like they hit the runway pretty short, right at the end of the numbers here on runway 23, and that'll be something that investigators will be looking at, is exactly where did they touch down on the runway. That's pretty darn short if that's where they hit for something like a CRJ. A crosswind landing in a jet is handled just like any other crosswind once you get close to the runway. In this case, he's got the right wing down into the wind to prevent drifting off of the center line of the runway. If you've got right aileron into the wind, it's going to induce a turning tendency to the right, so you got to straighten out the fuselage with the left rudder. So it's right aileron, left rudder to keep it going straight down the runway, but keep the wing down into the wind. Now you're basically cross-controlling the aircraft a little bit, producing a little more aerodynamic drag, so you got to add a little more power to compensate for this action. So one of the many things investigators will be looking at is how is the power managed on this approach, and was it kept in long enough to avoid a big sinker at the end of the runway? And that's kind of the technical term that we call this sort of a landing, is at the very end, a big sinker or a high rate of sink at the very end. And these jet engines take a little while to spool up and respond to those sinkers at the last moment. And remember, you can always go around. You can even go around after you hit the runway, but probably not advisable if you're missing a wing. Now let's go over and visit Victor at VAS Aviation. Please support his channel as he gets this data out from live ATC to the community very quickly.
Toronto Tower, Endeavor 4819, contact, runway 23. Endeavor 4819, Toronto Tower, wind 270, 23, gust 33, clear to land on runway 23, you might get a slight bump in the glide path, there'll be an aircraft in front of it. Clear to land, 23, Endeavor 4819.
No indication of any sort of a problem from Endeavor 4819. Some of the early speculation included maybe he was having problems with his flaps. CRJ 900 drivers, can you tell me, is the only allowable flap setting for the CRJ 45 degrees of flaps? Regardless, there's no indication of any problem from Endeavor 4819 on this communication. Now the tower tells them the winds 270 at 23, gust 33. Again, we talked about the crosswind component on this. That's including the gust component, gives you a headwind component of 25 knots and a crosswind component of 21 knots. Not including the gust, that's only a 14 knot crosswind component. Now about this part about you might get a slight bumping on the glide path. There'll be an aircraft parked in front of it. Somebody is parked in front of the ILS critical area, which is normal operations on a clear day like this day. Here's the Toronto airport. Here is runway 23, the landing runway. Here is the hold short marks for runway 23, but here is the ILS hold short point for runway 23. If the weather is bad and pilots are relying on the ILS to guide them into runway 23, the tower will hold aircraft back here at the ILS hold short line. But when the weather is good, they can go ahead and those minimums are spelled out specifically. If the weather's good enough, they can bring the aircraft and hold them short here of the normal runway hold short point. But this puts the aircraft parked in front of the ILS critical area, which means it might slightly upset the glide slope or localizer antenna on the arriving aircraft. So instead of having that localizer locked in, you might see a slight bump in that signal as you come on in. Here on the last 1,000 feet of the approach, it's more likely than not that the crew is hand flying the approach on in, following the guidance of the flight directors and the ILS, but primarily proceeding visually. And at this point in the landing phase, these last couple of data points, you are strictly visually looking out at the runway to determine your flare and your landing. You're no longer relying on the ILS this close in to judge your landing. But that being said, if you were following the ILS all the way into landing, you would be touching down way down here and not right here. This crew came up short. One of the many things investigators are going to be looking at is the runway condition. The RCR, or runway condition reading at the time of the accident, was reported as 5, 5, and 5. That means the touchdown portion of the runway, the mid-field portion of the runway, and the rollout portion of the runway were all reporting RCR of 5. And here's what that means according to the Canadian Advisory Circular. So here's the chart where you can see that these RCRs range in value from an RCR of 6, which is a perfectly dry runway, to a RCR of 0, which is a pilot braking action of less than poor or nil, virtually no braking action, like pure ice. And so today it was reported, or yesterday it was reported of RCR of 5, which is just one step below dry, frost or wet or snow up to 1/8 of an inch, pilot braking action good. Now, one of the things I think will be of significant interest to investigators is this notion of blowing snow across the runway. If you're based in Minnesota, you think you'd be used to this, but as a California guy, have you ever tried driving in these kind of conditions, let alone flying and landing, when the snow is driving across the runway, even an 1/8 inch or less, just a fine surface across the top of the runway? Not that it's so much a slick surface, but that it's visually distracting, a little bit visually disorienting. You might even be distracted long enough to take your mind off of the flare momentarily, but it can also obscure the edges and the edge markings on the runway, so you can miscue your distance above the runway when you're judging your flare. And finally, hats off to the professionalism of the flight attendant crew of Endeavor Air for safely getting everybody outside of that aircraft. And hats off to the other passengers that assisted in the evacuation as well. This is an extremely disorienting evacuation situation. It looks like they were primarily using one of the two over wing exits and the one right exit located right here. We don't see any pictures of the other side of the aircraft. We believe the other wing is still attached to the aircraft. I don't know if any folks got out on that side, but that was the side that was on fire, so it looks like most of the folks had to work their way out of this side of the aircraft. So this is a strong reminder for all of us that travel to pay attention to the flight attendant briefings. As an aircrew member, if I'm deadheading, I often get assigned one of these emergency exits. I will review the emergency exit card because whether you're seated next to a door exit or a overwing exit, those doors or hatches open up a little bit differently. So you need to review the card to figure out how to get it open, then decide, are you going to bring if it's a hatch, are you going to bring the hatch inside the aircraft? Are you going to toss it outside of the aircraft? And then pay attention to your surroundings. If I'm sitting next to the window, I've got the window up and I'm watching the takeoff roll. I'm watching the landing roll as well. And I'm usually dressed appropriately for some sort of an evacuation, including some decent shoes, no flip-flops. So a lot of questions investigators should be able to get back to us pretty quickly within a preliminary report. We've got a lot of change and turmoil in the industry as we need to backfill all these aviation jobs, as so many of us are retiring out, aging out at age 65, not only in just the pilot ranks, but in ATC and maintenance as well. And that's another thing investigators will be looking at. Was there any prior maintenance issues with this aircraft that could have led to that right wing snapping off so abruptly?
Okay, so that was a pretty in-depth analysis of what we have so far as the evidence. I was looking at the video with the plane coming in, and I don't see any flaps extended on the plane. Usually they're easy to see, and he was coming in a little bit hot, it looks like, but you never know. With the gusting winds, you do have to keep the speed up a little bit, because I was in a kind of a pickle down in Wildwood, New Jersey, a long time ago, flying with an instructor doing a check ride, and he wanted me to come in a little bit slower, and we had the gusty winds just like that, and this plane stalled about 100 feet above the runway. Luckily, we were able to catch it, and we landed okay, but it wasn't a good situation. So anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share this, and I hope to see you again on the next video. Thanks for watching again.